What is up, everybody? Random Random Man here, bringing you my review for Stan and Ollie. Based on the later lives of the comedy double act Laurel and Hardy, played by Steve Coogan and John C. Reilly respectively, the film focuses on their personal relationship while embarking on a grueling music hall tour across the United Kingdom and Ireland in 1953 while struggling to get another film made. Going into this movie, I had quite a bit of interest to see it, mainly for its subject matter, as I wasn't all that familiar with Laurel and Hardy prior to seeing this film. If you were to ask me which on-screen comedians from the first half of the 20th century I was previously familiar with, I would say people such as Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and the Three Stooges, though my introduction to Laurel and Hardy came in the form of reading about them in this book, 1,000 Years of Famous People. I got this when I was little. I used to flip through this all the time. As you can see here on the cover, there's Charlie Chaplin. And if you were to flip to this here section, there is Laurel and Hardy themselves. Buster Keaton is right there as well. And right below Laurel and Hardy, there are the Marx Brothers. Those are some other comedians I was previously familiar with as well. The two main actors of this film also got me interested to see it, with Steve Coogan and John C. Reilly being two really funny guys, and to see them playing iconic comedic figures such as Laurel and Hardy did get my interest piqued even more. Starting out with the cast and their performances, we have Steve Coogan in the role of Stanley Stan Laurel, the Englishman of the duo, and I took him as being more of the straight man of him and Ollie, as behind the scenes when they are not on stage, he seems like the more low-key, very kempt one of the two comedians here. And I thought he was not only very funny when he was performing, but also very believable in the dramatic moments of the film as well. And this came not that much of a surprise to me, as I knew in the past that he was capable of doing some dramatic acting, such as when he was in Philomena alongside Judi Dench. Coogan also co-wrote the screenplay for that movie with this movie's screenwriter, Jeff Pope, and both of them received Oscar nominations for Best Adapted Screenplay for that film. Setting aside that little tidbit though, I thought that Coogan was superb in this film, as is John C. Reilly as Oliver Ollie Hardy, also known as Babe by those close to him. This is a bit of a transformative role for Reilly, as there is terrific makeup work done on him to resemble the real-life Hardy, and he also had to wear a fat suit to get his physique to also resemble Hardy in that area as well. And I thought that the chemistry between him and Coogan was so delightful. I really believed that these two were not only longtime friends, but also longtime partners in them doing comedy across films and on stage. It also helps that these two have really amazing comedic timing with one another, whether it is subtle or overt when they are trying to recreate some of the more famous acts that Laurel and Hardy are famous for. Supporting players here include the likes of Shirley Henderson as Ollie's wife, Lucille. Longtime Harry Potter fans may recognize her as Moaning Myrtle from those films. There's also Nina Arianda as Stan's wife, Ida. These two are not just the wives of our main duo. They have quite a bit to do throughout the film when they do come into the picture. I thought that Ida as a character in particular was also very funny as Coogan and Reilly here. There's even Danny Houston as Hal Roach, this producer who Stan has had a bit of trouble with, and that's seen pretty early on in the film. But all in all, with the performances here, I thought they were all pretty outstanding, with a particular note going to Coogan and Reilly as Stan and Ollie. The writing of this film, once again, was done by Jeff Pope, who previously collaborated with Steve Coogan in writing Philomena together. Highly recommended you watch that movie, by the way. I think it's tremendous. And the way Pope sets up the narrative here, again, makes it clear that this is set in the later part of the careers of Laurel and Hardy, as the movie begins with them shooting one of their famous films, Way Out West, and that shows off how they were really big on the cinematic scene, some of the most famous comedians across Hollywood. And then the movie cuts to 16 years later, where they are trying to go on this music hall tour across the United Kingdom and Ireland, but they have a bit of trouble doing so. Other characters even point out how cool it is that Laurel and Hardy are still together after all these years performing, even though they don't bring as big of an audience as they once did years before in their prime. And on top of all this, they're trying to get another film made, a comedic version of Robin Hood, for which Laurel specifically keeps trying to come up material for, so that these two can, again, bring on the comedic magic. This is an approach to a biopic that has been done before quite often in recent memory, using a specific era or chunk of a person's life, or in this case, Laurel and Hardy's lives, to frame how the narrative will progress and be told here. And I've got to say that in the way it was structured, I was engaged throughout watching it, mainly because I was interested to see the story of these guys and what they are famous for, but also in this specific instance where the later lives of Laurel and Hardy are being told in how they are transitioning from mostly doing movies to doing this music hall tour and performing in front of people live, even if the numbers are dwindling. The movie also focuses quite a bit on their personal relationship outside of their professional careers, and the way the movie does present how these two guys are behind the scenes, you can tell that these guys really did like each other a lot. This also translated into the comedy of this movie, and since this movie is based on an iconic comedic duo, one should expect this movie to have quite a bit of humor as well too. And the way this movie is directed by John S. Baird, I thought really had some nice comedic timing throughout, due in part as well to the two leads in this film when they are recreating some of their performance sequences, and just seeing Laurel and Hardy doing their routines and their acts. Yeah, I thought it was charmingly amusing. I mean, the older couple behind me certainly thought so as well. They were constantly laughing their asses off. I thought it ran briskly at a little over an hour and a half. It's a very compact running time for a movie that is still loaded with content, even though it is on the shorter side. Really, I thought this was a wonderful movie overall, and issues I have with it are few and far between. Really, one could say that this movie is predictable after a certain point, especially in comparison to other biopics of recent memory. I say this because as Laurel and Hardy's music hall tour is continuing, it starts taking a toll on Ollie's health. And without giving much away, even though these two performers are long gone by now, yeah, he's told that he can no longer perform on stage. And I think anyone who watches this film can pretty much expect where this movie goes afterward. I do have to say that even with the movie being obvious in how it would end within its final moments, it does bring out some of the best acting I've ever seen from both Steve Coogan and John C. Reilly. Reilly, I think people forget in particular, has been nominated for an Oscar before, just like Steve Coogan has, even though Coogan's nomination was for writing. Reilly was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for Chicago. I think he's a pretty underappreciated actor for having as much range as he does have. Same with Coogan. The movie still tries to end on a lighthearted note, and it does end on a rousing level. It really had me feeling good leaving the theater after it was finished. And really, aside from that, there isn't that much to really complain about with this movie, as there's so much more to like, and mainly coming from me as somebody who was interested in the story of Stan and Ollie. In terms of technical merits with this film, in the way this movie is shot and looks overall, it is standardly done in the way the camera work is mostly stagnant throughout the rest of the film, although one thing that really stood out with the cinematography is the opening scene. as it is done in a long tracking shot that follows Laurel and Hardy as they are on their way to shoot one of their famous films I've mentioned before, Way Out West. And I thought that really gave me a sense of how movies were made back then in the 1930s. And then the rest of the way this movie looks with its production design, as the rest of it takes place in the 1950s, looks pretty accurate to the time period. The costume design is also stellar. Again, I have to give big props to the makeup department for really transforming John C. Reilly into becoming Oliver Hardy. Him and Coogan have been vocal in interviews saying that they are really big fans of this iconic comedic duo. And as far as how Coogan and Reilly compare to the real-life Laurel and Hardy, the movie ends with end credits that show actual footage from the movie Way Out West, and it really does give us a sense of the choreography and how spot on it was with Coogan and Reilly trying to capture the essence of what Stan and Ollie did many, many years ago. There's also real-life pictures shown of Stan and Ollie, and it really showed that these two actors really did capture how Stan and Ollie looked and acted. The final technical merit I have to give specific attention to is the original score by Rolf Kent. The music of this film added on to the sense of whimsy that this film created throughout, and even though this movie was inevitably going to end in a specific way, the score that was used during the final sequence of the film really did contribute to the sense of heartwarming nature that this movie was creating in that moment here. And that's what made this a winning movie altogether, as I really enjoyed Stan and Ollie overall. I'm actually a bit baffled that this movie hasn't gotten as much recognition this award season as other movies have. Yes, this is a pretty crowded award season this year, but this movie did pick up a bit of nominations recently in the past month or so. John C. Reilly got a nomination at the Golden Globes for Best Actor, Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy. Steve Coogan got a BAFTA nomination for Best Actor, and the movie also received an additional 2 BAFTA nominations for Best British Film and Best Makeup and Hairstyling. I would have expected this movie to be nominated for Best Makeup and Hair, given how earlier in the week the Oscar nominations were announced. But this movie was initially released, at least here in the US, on December 28th, 2018. And the significance of that is how, by Academy rules, a movie has to be playing in an LA County theater for at least 7 days for it to be considered for Oscar recognition. And I think that's pretty bogus that even though it was released at the tail end of 2018, it was pretty much disqualified for not having as long of a theater run as other films that also had limited releases at first. This weekend is actually the wide release of Stan and Ollie here in the US. And on that note, I think fans of Laurel and Hardy are going to get a kick out of watching this film. There are a bunch of references to the comedic duo's work, such as this clear homage to their short film, The Music Box, which, fun fact, was actually the first film to ever win the Best Live Action Short Oscar in the early 1930s. And even if you're not all that familiar with Laurel and Hardy, I think there is a lot to like here, regardless of your familiarity with this iconic comedic duo. And I have now become a fan of them after watching this film. I definitely recommend Stan and Ollie. My final verdict for Stan and Ollie is 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of Stan and Ollie. Social media links in the description. Subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.